Welcome to this deep dive,
Yeah.
curated just for you. We're diving into a topic that's been on everyone's mind lately, especially here in the UK, the impact of Ofsted inspections.
Yeah, it's a big one. And with everything that's happened recently, it feels even more urgent to talk about it, don't you think?
Absolutely. So to get to the heart of it, we're going to be looking closely at this blog post from June 2024.
From BRA, right?
Yes, the British Educational Research Association.
They do some really interesting work.
They do. And this particular article is titled Ofsted, Moving Towards Research in Education.
Catchy.
Well, it might sound a bit academic at first glance, but trust me, it gets right to the core of what we're talking about.
Especially given the timing. It was published just a few months before head teacher Ruth Perry passed away.
That's right. It was a real tragedy. And the article does address it. But what I found so interesting is that it goes beyond just calling for change. It actually offers a concrete solution.
A solution, like what?
Well, the authors, both experienced educators themselves, suggest that all Ofsted inspectors should have advanced degrees in education.
Whoa, hold on. Really? Like a master's or even a PhD?
That's what they're proposing.
That's a huge change. I mean, right now, the main qualification to be an inspector is QTS, right? Qualified teacher status.
Exactly. So this would be a radical shift.
It makes you wonder what that would actually look like in practice. How would it change the way schools are evaluated?
Right. And would it actually make a difference? I mean, we need to understand why the authors of this BER article are suggesting something so drastic.
Well, to do that, I think we need to go back to Ruth Perry's story.
It's a difficult one, but it's important.
It is. The coroner's report directly linked her death to the stress of a recent Ofsted inspection.
It's heartbreaking.
Yeah.
And it really highlights the immense pressure these inspections put on school leaders. It's not just a routine checkup.
Yeah.
You can feel like your whole career, your whole school community is being judged.
And the coroner didn't mince words either. They issued a stark warning, basically saying that without serious changes to the Ofsted system, future deaths could occur.
That's chilling. What were some of the specific concerns they raised?
Well, they outlined 7 key areas that needed to be addressed, both by Ofsted and the Department for Education.
7. That's a lot.
It is. 2 that stood out to me were the lack of training for inspectors, particularly around recognizing signs of stress in school leaders,
That makes sense.
and also the way some inspections are conducted.
So not just what's being evaluated, but how it's done.
Exactly. And that brings us back to the BER article, because the authors argue that to prevent future tragedies and really improve the quality of education, Ofsted needs to become more evidence-informed.
Okay, evidence-informed. What does that actually mean? It sounds like they're talking about something beyond just practical experience in the classroom.
You're right. They're talking about a level of rigor and methodology that you normally associate with academic research.
So holding inspectors to the same standards as university researchers.
That's the idea. They're saying that inspectors, with the power they have to impact schools and careers, should be held to those same high standards.
Wow. That's a fascinating comparison. I mean, think about it. We have ethical review boards at universities to scrutinize research and protect participants.
Exactly. Ofsted doesn't have anything like that.
That's a pretty stark difference.
Yeah.
So the Beer article is suggesting that by requiring advanced degrees for inspectors, you're basically injecting that same level of rigor and ethical awareness into the inspection process.
Precisely. And they actually quote a previous BR blog post from 2017 by Frank Caulfield.
Caulfield. He's done a lot of work on assessment, hasn't he?
He has, and he's very critical of Ofsted.
Yeah.
He says, and I quote, "Ofsted has done more harm than good. Its methods were invalid, unreliable, and unjust."
Strong words.
They are. And it shows that these concerns about Ofsted's impact didn't just appear after Ruth Perry's death. They've been around for a while.
So why haven't things changed? If these issues have been raised before, why are we still having this conversation?
It's a good question, and I think it speaks to a larger issue. But there's no doubt that Ruth Perry's passing brought a new sense of urgency. Even her sister, Julia Waters, has called for really radical change, systemic change, cultural change at Ofsted.
So just tweaking the system isn't going to cut it.
Right. And that's where another quote from the BR article really hits home. It's from a book by Michael Fullen, an expert on educational reform. He says, and I'm paraphrasing here, that real change requires a fundamental shift in thinking. You can't just add a checklist or a training module and expect everything to be fixed.
So it's about changing the whole mindset around school evaluations.
Exactly. And that's what makes this proposal to require advanced degrees for inspectors so interesting. It's not just about adding a qualification. It's about bringing in a whole new way of thinking and approaching the evaluation process.
Okay, so let's unpack that a bit. What would this kind of change look like in practice? What are the potential benefits and drawbacks? And most importantly, what would it mean for you, the listener? Whether you're a teacher, a parent, or just someone who cares about education.
Well, to answer those questions, we need to take a closer look at the world of educational research itself.
Let's do it. So if Ofsted inspections were more like academic research, how would that actually change things?
Well, for one thing, I think it would change how inspectors approach the whole evaluation process. Instead of just relying on what they see during a short visit,
Right.
they might start to take a more data-driven approach.
So using actual evidence to support their judgment.
Exactly. Imagine inspectors who can actually analyze student performance data over time or assess the impact of different teaching methods based on solid research.
It's about bringing a more scientific perspective to the process,
Right.
not just relying on gut feelings or impressions.
Precisely. And that really aligns with what the BER article is talking about.
Yeah.
That whole idea of Ofsted becoming truly evidence-informed.
It makes sense in theory, but let's be realistic here. This kind of change wouldn't happen overnight. It would require a massive overhaul of the whole system.
You're not wrong. It would be a huge undertaking.
I mean, how do we even find enough qualified people to become inspectors if we suddenly raise the bar that high?
Yeah, that's a legitimate concern. We'd have to rethink the whole recruitment and training process. And of course, there's the issue of resources. Would there be enough funding to properly train inspectors in all these new skills?
And wouldn't there be a risk of creating a disconnect between theory and practice? I mean, we don't want inspectors who are so focused on research that they lose touch with what's actually happening in classrooms.
That's a valid point. It's
Yeah.
all about finding that balance,
Yeah.
Maybe we could have a system where inspectors have both a strong research background and recent experience teaching in schools.
So like a hybrid approach. I like that.
It could work, but what about the impact on schools themselves? If we raise the bar for inspectors, wouldn't that just put even more pressure on teachers and school leaders?
Yeah, I could see that happening. It's like that whole thing with high-stakes testing. Sometimes it can lead to unintended consequences, like teachers feeling pressure to teach to the test instead of focusing on what's best for the students.
Yeah, exactly. And we wouldn't want to create a system where schools are so obsessed with meeting certain metrics that they lose sight of the bigger picture.
The joy of learning.
Exactly. But let's not forget about the other side of things, too. Remember what the coroner said about the need for fairness, respect, and sensitivity during inspections.
It was pretty alarming to hear some of those details.
It was. And it made me think, what if we applied the principles of ethical research to inspections? What if Ofsted had something like an ethical review board to make sure that the methods they're using are actually protecting the well-being of everyone involved?
That's an interesting thought. It would definitely shift the power dynamics a bit, wouldn't it? It would mean that the well-being of the school community is a top priority, not just an afterthought.
And it could make the whole experience a lot less stressful for everyone involved, Maybe it would even lead to more meaningful feedback and more constructive conversations between inspectors and educators.
That's what we should be aiming for, right? Inspections that are seen as opportunities for growth and improvement, not just these scary judgments.
Exactly. And while requiring advanced degrees for inspectors might not solve every problem, it definitely raises some important questions.
Like what?
Well, like, what is the real purpose of school inspections? How can we balance accountability with well-being? And how can we make sure that evaluations are fair, rigorous, and respectful?
Those are big questions.
They are, and they're questions that everyone should be thinking about, not just people in academia.
So parents, teachers, policymakers, anyone who cares about education.
Exactly. And I think that's one of the most important takeaways from this BER article. It's not just about offering a specific solution. It's about sparking a wider conversation about how we evaluate schools and support the people who work in them.
So it's about moving beyond the blame game and actually working together to create a better system for everyone.
Precisely. So where do we go from here? How do we turn this conversation into action?
Well, I think the first step is to stay informed. Pay attention to the research. Talk to your colleagues in your communities. Make your voice heard.
Right. And remember that change doesn't happen in isolation. It takes collaboration, open-mindedness, and a willingness to challenge the status quo.
And at the end of the day, it's all about making sure that every child has access to a quality education that meets their needs and helps them reach their full potential.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
So we've explored this idea of requiring advanced degrees for Ofsted inspectors. We've talked about the potential benefits and drawbacks, and we've delved into the world of educational research. But now I'm curious, what does all this mean for you, the listener? How does this conversation connect with your own experiences and your own views on education?
It's been quite a deep dive, hasn't it? thinking about Ofsted inspectors and whether they should have a background in educational research.
Yeah, it really makes you think about what we actually value in
Mm.
education.
Exactly.
Like, how do we measure success, and how can we make sure that the way we evaluate schools is both rigorous and fair?
Tough questions.
They are.
Yeah.
But I think that's what makes these conversations so important. It's so true. So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to take a step back for a moment and think about the bigger picture.
Okay.
Let's imagine for a second that we actually did implement this radical change, requiring advanced degrees for Ofsted inspectors. What kind of ripple effects might we see across the whole education system?
Hmm. Well, I think it could potentially lead to a much deeper understanding of what teaching and learning actually involve. You know?
More than just ticking boxes.
Right. Imagine inspectors who are trained to see those subtle things that happen in classrooms, the different ways that teachers approach their work, and the unique needs of each student.
So moving away from that one-size-fits-all mentality.
Exactly. It could give school leaders more freedom to try new things and be innovative.
Because they know that they won't be penalized for taking risks.
Right. They'd be evaluated by people who understand the complexities of education.
That's an exciting thought. But of course, there are always potential downsides, too. We've talked about the logistics, the resources, and the importance of staying connected to what's happening in real classrooms.
Yeah, we wouldn't want to create a system that's all theory and no practice.
Exactly. But even if this particular proposal never actually happens, I still think that having these conversations is incredibly valuable.
I agree. It forces us to confront our assumptions and look for new ways of doing things.
And that's where you, the listener, come in. This isn't just some abstract debate. It's about shaping the future of education.
For our children and for future generations.
So we really encourage you to keep this conversation going. Talk to your friends, your family, your colleagues, anyone who will listen.
Share your ideas, your concerns, your hopes for the future of education.
Because at the end of the day, the quality of our education system affects all of us.
It's a shared responsibility.
We hope this deep dive has given you some new things to think about.
Some new perspectives.
And maybe even some inspiration to make a difference.
As we wrap up, I want to leave you with one final thought.
Okay.
What kind of education system do we want to build for the future?
One that focuses on standardized tests and narrow metrics.
Or one that values creativity, critical thinking, problem solving?
A system that prepares students for the real world.
The choice is ours.
And it starts with conversations like these. So thank you for joining us on this deep dive.